Let's talk about audio versus video podcasting.
This is the place for podcasters.
Hey, welcome to the channel. My name's Brian here with Summit City Studios, and this is the place for podcasters. On this channel, we talk about tips, tools, and tech to help you create a great podcast. And today, I want to talk about the pros and the cons of audio podcasting versus video podcasting. And to get that conversation started, I want to address something that has kind of been a pet peeve of mine that I'm just now starting to learn how to get over. And that is that a podcast by nature has always, in my brain, been audio only. When I talk to people about having a podcast, they always, a lot of times, mention that, oh yeah, I saw your podcast. And I'm like, no, you didn't see my podcast. You saw my YouTube channel. My podcast, you have to listen to it. You have to search for it and you have to listen to it because a YouTube channel is something different. But I guess in some way you can consider what I'm doing right now a podcast because I'm talking about podcasting with a podcasting setup, but I'm filming it. But this, I'm not actually posting to iTunes or Apple or Google or any of those podcast places. This is strictly for YouTube. And I know there are podcasters who create audio content, but they also film it. So they post it on YouTube or they send it out to other places. And the rise of the video podcast is upon us now. And so I have to come to terms with that and I have to learn to accept that. But okay, enough of my confusing, weird little rant. Let's talk about audio versus video podcasting. And here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to offer up a couple of categories and we're going to award points to audio podcasting if audio has the advantage in that category, or to video podcasting if I believe video podcasting has the advantage in that category. And we're going to start by talking about the equipment necessary to doing an audio versus video podcast. This one's really easy. All you need to do an audio podcast is something to record yourself, something to edit, and a place to upload that podcast. I did another video on this topic on what you need to do a podcast. You can find it there, so I won't talk too much about it. But really, you can do it with your phone. You can do it with a pair of earbuds, and that's all you need. So then for a video podcast, you also need a camera. You're going to need something to record yourself, video-wise and audio-wise. So equipment-wise, we are going to give the point to the audio podcast because you don't need much to get started. And even when you upgrade, it's probably going to be cheaper than buying a camera. And to do it right, really, a video podcast, if it's more than one person, you're going to need multiple camera angles. Plus your set needs to look good, all that. I'll stop there. Point to audio podcasts for the equipment. Now, let's talk about graphics. Again, this one's obvious. This one's really easy. For an audio podcast, you can't have any graphics unless you post links in your show notes that people have to scroll through, click the link, and go to. Then you can post anything that you happen to talk about on the podcast, but it's not front and center right there as you're speaking. So obviously the advantage for visuals and graphics goes to the video podcast because you just do not have that opportunity or access to that on an audio podcast. So far, we've got point for audio, point for video. Now let's talk about editing, because editing's a whole separate thing. You can record the podcast audio or video, and you can upload straight from the raw file that you just recorded. I do not advise that because you're going to get a better sound from editing. You're going to be able to cut out all your mistakes, all your ums and uhs and dogs barking and cars driving by, whatever happens to get into your audio mix or your video mix. But to edit an audio podcast and a video podcast is quite different. Audio, obviously, you're only editing the audio. So you can chop that file up. You can splice it back together. There are techniques you can use that maybe I'll talk about in another video and make it sound like a seamless interview, seamless conversation. And it's not that difficult to do. But when you start chopping up video, again, back to the visuals that give video the advantage, you're also seeing all the jump cuts and all the fades and all the cross dissolves and all the transitions that you add adds to the time and the skill that you need to be able to edit a video podcast well. So when it comes to editing, we're giving the point to the audio podcast. So far, 2 points for the audio podcast and 1 point for the video podcast. Let's move on now and talk about uploading that file, that finished product. Now, you're going to upload a video and an audio podcast in separate places. So let's just say you do one or the other. You either do audio only or video only podcast. Uploading an audio podcast is pretty straightforward. It's a matter of uploading your MP3 most often, or potentially even a WAV file, depending on the requirements of your host site. As you do that, you're going to type out your show notes, and with one click, it will update your RSS feed and send it out to whatever podcast directories that you have been approved to be on. Video podcast is a little different because there are several steps that you have to follow with the description, the tags, and all of that. But when it comes to just the upload process, I'm going to actually call it a draw. No one's a winner here. Audio podcasting is straightforward, but if you're uploading videos consistently to YouTube, you know that process. It's not too difficult once you kind of get in the rhythm and the process of it all. So we're just going to call that one a draw. Now let's talk about the next category, which is the personality of the individuals who are on the podcast. So the host, the guest, the co-host, however many people and whoever it happens to be who are on your podcast, how do they show their personality? My first thought was to give the advantage here to the video podcaster, because in my mind, you can show off a lot more of your personality on video. As you're talking, you can be heard and you can be seen, and your personality can really shine through. However, I know that a lot of people freeze up when they get on camera. But if you can put them in front of a microphone with no one else around other than one or two people to have a conversation, that's when their personality really takes off and really shines through. So I'm going to actually give this one it's going to be a draw. That's right. I'm going to call the personality category a draw, because I think it really depends on the individuals who are on the podcast as to how they are going to be more comfortable in putting their personality on display. For some, it's audio, and for some, it's video. So we're going to call this one a draw. That brings me to the final category that I want to talk about today, which is searchability. The searchability of an audio versus a video podcast. And this one can be a tough one, because searchability of a podcast, you typically, when you go on Apple or Spotify, the two big ones, Google Podcast, you have an idea of what you're looking for. Maybe someone's recommended a show, maybe someone's recommended an author or a podcast host, and you're searching for that thing specifically. And when you know you're looking for it and you know what you're looking for, you can pretty easily find it. Video podcasts, I think there's a lot more you can do, because YouTube is a search engine. It is the second most visited and most used search engine next to Google itself. So if you go to YouTube, you can type in questions, you can type in keywords, you can type in names of individuals and authors and podcast hosts, and you name it, and you can find what you're looking for. And it gives you maybe a broader range of how to search for the thing that you're looking for. So you might actually stumble upon someone's video podcast on YouTube that you never knew existed because you typed in a particular keyword or asked a particular question that you wouldn't find in the audio realm of podcasting. So for searchability's sake, I'm going to give this one to the video podcast, because you can find more of what you're looking for on the video platform. So if I'm doing the math right, that's 2 pros for the audio podcast and 2 pros for the video podcast, and 2 areas where it could go either way. So which do I recommend? Well, I think that's up to you to decide. Are you more of the audio podcast listener or more of the video podcast viewer? Are you more comfortable on camera or more comfortable in a room by yourself behind a microphone? Ultimately, I think it's up to you, your personality, and your personal preferences. Now, podcasting, audio podcasting is maybe more convenient and more accessible for people on the go. But remember that video podcasting is more searchable and discoverable that way. Which brings me to one last thing I want to talk about, which is, what if we did both? What if we filmed a podcast, recorded a podcast. We stripped the audio from it. We posted the audio to the audio podcast directories, and we posted our video version of the podcast to YouTube. And lots of people are doing that. And I think there's some advantages and maybe even some disadvantages to that. So let me offer a couple things to consider. The first thing is that when you're doing audio versus video, your call to actions are going to be different. You talk about following your podcast on Spotify or subscribing to the podcast on Apple or Google. You're not going to talk about following or subscribing in the same way as you would on YouTube, because there's a like button on YouTube and there's a subscribe and a notification bell that aren't available on these other platforms. So your calls to action are going to be different. The second thing I would encourage you to consider is, if you're doing both an audio and a video podcast, is to have a central location to point your listeners and your viewers to for more information. The third factor I would suggest you consider if you're going to do both an audio and a video version of your podcast is, if you're thinking long-term and you're thinking about growth and you're thinking about monetization, consider how you're going to monetize both. If you have both and they grow, that's multiple opportunities to monetize the same content. But the truth of the matter is, it's really difficult to grow, to build an audience both with your audio podcast and an audience on YouTube or whatever video outlet you choose for your video podcast. Your attention is going to be drawn in two different directions, and it takes a lot of work to do both. It can be done. And if you have the time and you have the ability and the flexibility and the knowledge to do it, I say go for it. So there you have it. I think there's pros and cons to doing just an audio podcast, and there's pros and cons to doing just a video podcast, and there's some advantages and maybe some disadvantages to doing both. I'm curious what you have in mind if you were to start a podcast right now in this very moment. Would you lean towards starting an audio only or a video only podcast, or would you do both and try and figure out how to use them in separate ways? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video. Don't forget to visit summitcitystudios.com, where you can find some sweet merch like this that I'm wearing right now, and you can find out how I can help you create a great sounding podcast.